Buildings remember things people forget. Theaters remember above the stage, in the dark, where the scenery hangs and the audience never looks. Leland Morrows has spent 25 years learning to read that darkness inside the Orpheum Grand Theater, a 1936 performing arts house, whose original hempen counterweight fly system still raised and lowered scenery the same way it had for nearly 90 years. Dozens of rigging lines, each balanced by stacked steel weights, operated by hand from a rail at stage level. He was 60 now, head stage carpenter and rigging keeper, responsible for the slow choreography of tons of scenery moving silently above performers' heads, 8 shows a week, without anyone below ever thinking about it. He had learned the rigging from a man named Stanis Novak, who had flown scenery at the Orpheum for 31 years before him and who believed, with a certainty he never softened for anyone, that a fly system was a set of scales, and scales only stay honest if somebody keeps weighing them. Leland started at the Orpheum at 35, hired as Novak's second during a season when the theater was mounting a repertory schedule heavy enough to need 2 full-time riggers. Novak was 62 then, thick-wristed and deliberate, a man who moved along the fly rail the way other men moved through their own kitchens, his hands finding rope locks without looking. "Every line in this house is a promise," Novak told him during Leland's first week, the two of them standing at the rail while a painted backdrop drifted down toward the stage as gently as a falling leaf. "The weight up top matches the weight in the arbor, and the promise holds. But promises drift, cable stretches, sheaves wear, buildings move. You weigh every line at the top of every season, and you write it down, because the day you stop weighing is the day you start guessing. And nobody guessing should ever stand under a baton." Novak kept weight ledgers, hardbound books recording exactly how much counterweight each of the theater's 48 rigging lines required to balance, rechecked and relogged at the start of every season. The theater didn't require it. Novak required it of himself, and then of Leland, and the requirement outlived them both asking why. Leland remembered his first season weigh-in. 2 full days of stripping lines, hanging test weights, adjusting arbors brick by brick, while Novak called figures from the rail and wrote them down in a slow, deliberate hand. Halfway through the second day, Leland had asked, honestly and without malice, whether anyone would ever actually read these numbers. Novak had finished the entry he was writing before answering. "Probably not," he'd said. "Right up until the season somebody needs them. Then they'll be the only thing in this building worth reading." When Novak retired, he left Leland the full shelf of ledgers, along with a piece of advice Leland had carried for 25 years since. "The lines will tell you when something changes. Not loudly. Half a brick at a time. Keep weighing." The Orpheum was the kind of theater that made touring crews slow down when they walked in. A gilded 1936 proscenium, a house of 1,400 seats, rising into shadow, and above the stage a fly loft 7 stories tall, its grid of steel beams holding the sheaves through which every line ran. The public saw velvet and gold leaf. Leland's world was above the ceiling, the loft, the grid, the rail, the quiet machinery of illusion. He knew the building the way he knew his own tools. He knew the loading gallery's third ladder rung sat slightly proud and had caught a generation's shins. He knew which rope locks sang in dry winters and which arbors ticked as the house cooled after a show. He knew the smell of the loft, hemp dust, and 90 years of paint, and how it sharpened before rain, when the roof vents drew differently. And he knew, better than anyone alive, that line 23 had been slowly gaining weight for 40 years. It wasn't dramatic. No operator pulling line 23 would notice anything on any given night. The line ran smooth, held its trim, flew its scenery as obediently as any of its 47 neighbors. Visiting crews used it without comment. Guest riggers rated the whole system a beautifully kept antique. But at the start of every season, when the lines were stripped, weighed, and rebalanced, line 23 asked for a little more steel in its arbor than the ledger said it had needed the year before. Half a brick, sometimes less, almost never nothing. One veteran flyman from a touring house, watching a seasonal weigh-in years back, had noticed Leland adding the extra steel and asked what the line carried that its neighbors didn't. Leland had answered honestly, nothing anyone had ever found. The flyman had laughed and called it the house's tax. Every old theater collects one somewhere. Leland had written the phrase into the ledger that evening, because it was funny, and because underneath the joke, it was exactly wrong. Taxes stay the same. This one kept rising. Novak's earliest surviving entry about it, dated 1986, read, asterisk line 23 heavy again this season. Added half a brick to balance. Recheck sheaves, recheck cable, rechecked arbor. All sound. The line isn't gaining weight. Something up top is giving ground. Watching it, asterisk. Leland had read that entry during his first winter with the Ledgers, sitting in the small rigging office beneath the loading gallery, and it felt something settle into place that he wouldn't fully understand for years. Novak had noticed something real. Novak had never solved it. And Novak had kept weighing anyway, season after season, patient enough to record a pattern he never got to finish explaining. Leland continued the weigh-ins without ever being asked to. Each season, line 23 went into the ledger beside its 47 neighbors, and each season it asked for its small tribute of extra steel. He noted it the way Novak had, plainly without theory. The pattern held. Season after season, never reversing. In his 14th year with the Ledgers, Leland did something Novak's entries had never quite done. He added the numbers up. Novak had recorded each season's adjustment as its own event. Half a brick here, a quarter there, without ever totaling the drift across decades. Leland, on a slow, dark week afternoon, worked backward through every ledger on the shelf, summing line 23's additions from 1986 to present, then comparing the total against every other line in the house. The other 47 lines drifted the way old systems drift, a little up, a little down, wander around their original balance as cables were replaced and sheaves were serviced. Line 23 alone moved in one direction only. 40 years of small additions, never once subtraction, accumulating into a figure that startled him when he finally wrote it down. The line now carried substantially more counterweight than its 1936 design ever called for, and the rate wasn't slowing. If anything, the recent season's additions were arriving slightly larger. He sat with that total for a long time, the loft silent above him, the ghost light burning alone on the stage below, the house beyond it 1,400 empty seats deep in shadow. He thought about the thousands of performances that had played out under that grid since 1986, dancers, orchestras, school recitals, children squinting up into the dark during intermission, while 70 feet above them, someone had been quietly asking for half a brick more every season, and only two men in the building's whole history had been keeping the receipts. A line didn't gain weight. Novak had said so from the beginning. The scenery hadn't changed. The cable had been replaced twice. The arbor was the same steel frame it had always been, which meant Novak's other sentence was the one that mattered. Something up top is giving ground. He climbed to the grid that same night with flashlight, not measuring anything, just walking the steel above line 23 and looking at rivets, at beams, at 90 years of paint and dust. Everything looked exactly the way it had looked his entire career. Whatever was moving, it was moving too slowly for eyes. He wrote his own note beneath the total, in the same plain hand Novak had modeled. Astor's 40 years of additions, one direction, accelerating. The line is honest. The building above it is not where it used to be. Cause unknown. Continuing to weigh. Asterisk. He underlined continuing. It felt like the only honest word available to him. Leland had a theory in his 18th year that the cause might be sheave where the grooved wheels high in the grid slowly cutting deeper under 90 years of cable, changing the geometry of the lift enough to alter the balance season by season. He spent a dark week that summer on the grid with a flashlight and calipers, measuring the groove depth of every sheave in line 23's run, comparing them against the sheaves on the lines to either side, convinced he had finally found something a machinist could fix. The measurements ruled it out. Line 23's sheaves showed ordinary wear, no deeper, no different than the sheaves on lines 22 and 24, which had held their balance for decades. Whatever was moving wasn't the wheels the cable rode on. It was whatever the wheels were bolted to. He had been wrong. He wrote it plainly in the ledger, in the same unembellished style Novak had taught him without ever meaning to teach a lesson. Asterisk sheave wear theory. Ruled out. Grooves ordinary across the run. The problem is not in the machinery. It is in the steel the machinery hangs from. Back to unexplained. Asterisk. It bothered him more than most of his wrong guesses did. He had wanted the sheaves to be the answer, replaceable parts, a work order, A closed question. Being wrong meant the cause lived in the roof structure itself, 70 feet above the stage, in steel that had been inspected and passed every survey the theater had ever commissioned. The modernization announcement arrived in its 23rd year. The Orpheum's board approved a long-debated conversion of the fly system to motorized hoists, motors mounted directly onto the existing roof steel above the stage, positioned according to the original 1936 structural drawings, replacing hemp and counterweight with push-button precision. The theater called it the largest backstage investment in its history. The hemp lines, including line 23, would be retired. Leland read the engineering brief twice and felt an old unease sharpen into urgency. The hoist positions were laid out against the 1936 drawings, the same drawings as Ledgers had spent 40 years quietly contradicting. Motors didn't need balancing. Motors didn't get weighed at the top of every season. Once the hoist went in, the one instrument that had been measuring whatever was moving above line 23 would be dismantled, and heavy new machinery would be bolted to the exact steel that 2 generations of riggers had watched give ground half a brick at a time. He brought Novak's Ledgers, along with his own 25 seasons of weigh-ins, to the modernization project's structural engineer. The engineer was a thorough, well-regarded man named Dorian Ashby, who reviewed the roof steel's most recent inspection with Leland across a table in the theater's production office. The inspection had been visual, conducted from the grid level, checking members against the 1936 drawings. Everything was present, intact, and rated sound. Counterweight drift on a hemp-era system is almost always cumulative cable stretch and hardware wear, Ashby said, and he said it reasonably, as someone who had converted a dozen historic houses. 90 years of it. Honestly, half a brick a season is modest. The motors make all of this moot. They don't balance. They just lift. Your Ledgers are impressive, but they're measuring an obsolete system's aging, not the building. The cable's been replaced twice, Leland said. The drift survived both replacements without a hiccup, and the sheaves measure the same as the lines beside them. It isn't the system aging. Novak wrote it in 1986. The line isn't gaining weight. Something up top is giving ground. 40 years later, the Ledgers say he was right, and the additions are getting bigger, not smaller. Ashby considered that, and to his credit, didn't wave it away. The steel passed inspection. Every member matches the drawings. I can't reopen a structural scope based on counterweight arithmetic when the survey says the grid is sound. The budget doesn't carry exploratory work without cause. It was a reasonable position, and Leland didn't have an engineering credential to argue against it. What he had was 40 years of one-directional numbers, a ruled-out theory, and a growing conviction that the inspection had checked whether the steel was present, not whether it was still exactly where 1936 had left it. Leland didn't sleep well through the weeks that followed. He kept circling back to a question he couldn't put down. What if Ashby was right, and 40 years of careful weighing amounted to nothing more than an old system aging the way old systems age, a pattern he and Novak, between them, had slowly polished into a mystery through sheer accumulated devotion? He was 60 years old, 3 seasons at most from retirement, and the modernization was going to retire the hemp system regardless of anything he said. It would be easy, it would be reasonable, to let the Ledgers go into a box and the motors go onto the steel and the whole question dissolve quietly into the past along with his job title. Raising it again and being wrong meant ending 25 years as the old rigger who saw ghosts in arithmetic. He had wanted, for years, for line 23's numbers to mean something. Wanting it to matter wasn't the same as it actually matching. He pulled Novak's 1986 ledger down one more evening and reread the entry under the rigging office lamp. Asterisk, the line isn't gaining weight. Something up top is giving ground. Watching it, asterisk. Novak had never known the cause either. He had simply kept weighing, season after season, trusting that the pattern was worth preserving even without an explanation attached. Leland had inherited that trust without ever fully testing whether to stand against a clean inspection and a confident professional. He didn't have the cause confirmed. But not having it hadn't stopped Novak from writing the first entry in 1986. It wasn't a reason for Leland to stop now. Not with motors about to be bolted to one section of roof his Ledgers said was no longer where the drawings promised. He requested, at his own initiative, a single day with a structural surveyor before the hoist installation began. Not to delay the modernization. He made clear only to measure the grid above line 23 precisely, while the loft was still empty enough to allow it. The surveyor was a woman named Priya Anand, who specialized in precision measurement of historic steel structures. She reviewed the Orpheum's 1936 drawings alongside Leland's ledgers, and she brought a laser level and optical survey equipment up to grid on a quiet Monday when the stage below stood dark. What she found, confirmed by the end of a single day, explained 40 years of half-bricks that nobody had ever been able to name. The section of roof truss directly above line 23 sat measurably lower than the trusses to either side, lower than the 1936 drawings placed it, by an amount invisible to the eye from grid level but unmistakable to the laser. And at the heart of that section, where the drawing showed a standard truss connection, the steel itself told a different story. A splice detail that matched nothing on the original plans, visibly cruder than the surrounding fabrication, joining two members with a plate noticeably lighter than the connections elsewhere in the grid. This splice is a 1936 work, Priya said, showing Leland the survey plot on her laptop at the rail. The welding style, the plate size, this is a later alteration, and an undersized one, mid-century, at a guess. Wartime work often looked like this. Steel was rationed, contractor substituted, and the paperwork rarely survived. This splice has been deflecting under load ever since, sagging, tiny amounts, decade after decade. The block shear line 23 runs through hang from this exact section. As it settles, the whole geometry of that lift keeps changing. That's your half-brick. That's 40 years of it. Leland thought about the theater's archives, the gap everyone knew about, the war years when records went thin everywhere. A 1943 alteration for ventilation ducting appeared in one surviving invoice with no drawings attached. Nobody had ever connected an invoice to a truss. Nobody had ever had a reason to. The ducting itself had been removed in some later renovation. Only the splice that once accommodated it remained, holding up its corner of the grid with less steel than every drawing in the building claimed it had. The line was never gaining weight, he said quietly. No, Priya said. The roof was coming down to meet it, slowly enough that only a scale would ever notice. Your predecessor built the scale. You kept reading it. 80 years of a wartime shortcut, and the only continuous record of it in existence is a shelf of counterweight ledgers, two riggers, kept because one of them believed scales should stay honest. Priya's findings went to the modernization committee within the week. Dorian Ashby reviewed the survey plot personally and called Leland afterward. You were right to push, Ashby said. The inspection confirmed the steel was there. It never asked whether it had moved. If we'd mounted hoists on that splice per the drawings, we'd have concentrated new dynamic loads on the one weakened connection in the entire grid. Over a stage of performers under 8 shows a week. Your ledgers weren't measuring an old system. They were measuring the roof. The project was revised. The wartime splice was exposed, reinforced with a properly engineered connection, and the truss section restored to its design position before a single motor was hung. The hoist layout was recalculated against the building as it actually stood, not as 1936 had drawn it. The Orpheum filed a formal note in its production archive, crediting both Stanis Novak's original 1986 observation and Leland's 25 seasons of continued weigh-ins as the reason a hidden structural defect was found during the only project in 90 years positioned to fix it. Leland kept the ledgers. He added a final entry before moving the shelf into the theater's archive. Asterisk truss above line 23 surveyed. Splice reinforced. Geometry restored this year. Defect traced to an undocumented wartime alteration. Measured half a brick at a time since 1986. First season on record with no addition. Stanis, you were right. The line was honest. It was the roof that moved. Neither of us knew for a very long time. Asterisk. He stood at the fly rail on a quiet evening after the motors went live, watching a batten rise on its new hoist, silent and level, above a stage where the ghost light burned alone. Out of habit, he rested his hand on line 23's old rope lock. Still mounted though the line was gone. He thought about Novak, standing at the same rail decades earlier, telling a nervous new hire that every line in the house was a promise, And that scales only stay honest if somebody keeps weighing them. Leland had carried that sentence through 25 years, through a ruled-out theory, through a season of real doubt about whether 2 careers of half-bricks had amounted to anything more than ritual. He hadn't needed to understand the cause immediately. He had only needed to keep weighing, the way Novak had taught him, until the building finally confessed, half a brick at a time, to the only 2 men in 90 years who never stopped counting.